Welcome to Books in Five, where we are interviewing the authors of recently published books on relevant topics. I'm very excited about my guest today, as she has written an excellent new book describing her travels all over America in these unsettling times. Sarah, I'm so glad you could join us today. Please tell us your name, the title of your book, and a little bit more about your background.
Sure. I'm Sarah Kendzior. My new book is called The Last American Road Trip. I started out as an anthropologist studying authoritarian regimes, particularly in the former Soviet Union. And then over the last decade and a half, have worked mostly on institutional collapse within the United States. This book is a little different. It's a memoir, it's a travelogue, but it does, because of the times we live in, encapsulate elements of my previous work.
Great. Let's start with question number one. Your book covers your experience driving around the country with your family to visit a wide variety of destinations, both popular and obscure. Tell us a little bit more about your motivation for going on these trips.
Well, I first started traveling with my kids in 2016 when they were 5 and 9 years old, and Trump had recently been elected. That wasn't the pure impetus for the trip, although it contributed to it because he began his term by threatening to decimate national parks, historical sites, which he's doing now. I was worried about collapse in general, ecological, societal, and I wanted my kids to see the United States through their eyes, to see everything on the chance that it may fall apart. Because I had been watching the United States fall apart through my lifetime. This is not necessarily anything new. It was also just a really good excuse for a vacation. And we live in Missouri. We live in the center of the US. So whenever we take a vacation, we drive. And that means that we drive in every direction. We get to see the landscape change before our eyes. We get to see it change from mountains to plains to swamplands to oceans. And for a kid to be able to see that themselves, to have that kind of firsthand experience that dispels so many myths and so much prejudice, I think is a really important thing for our time.
And obviously, being in a car rather than flying makes such a big difference, right? Tell us about why you wanted to spend all those hours in a confined vehicle rather than just fly to your destinations, right?
Well, it's pretty common in the Midwest for people to take very long road trips. They're only very long from the perspective of people who live elsewhere. Like when we hear about a 7 or 8 hour drive, we kind of shrug. You're like, yeah, no big deal. 13, 14 hours, maybe pushing it. A lot of this has to do with there just aren't that many places to fly to from our airports. It's just easier. It's cheaper. I think, I don't like to generalize about the Midwest, but I do think we're a thrifty kind of people. And to have four people in a car is a hell of a lot cheaper than four people on a plane. And I think there's an advantage in that because what happens when you take a road trip is you see a lot of serendipitous sightings. You see a lot of places that you're not setting out for as a destination, but you just happen to encounter on the side of the road. And they're often bizarre things. They're folk art created by somebody in the 70s. They're, signs posted by fanatics. They're weird little museums devoted to all sorts of strange things. We went to a museum of barbed wire out in, rural Texas that I was not, that was actually housed in an old bra factory. And I was not expecting to do that. I had not incorporated that into our plans. But the minute I saw it, I was like, let's see what's in there. Let's see what the devil's rope has to offer. And so those sorts of experiences can't be replicated by plane, and they can't be replicated through an organized tour. And they lead to a lot of discussion among the family. And, the last thing I wanted is for a vacation to feel like homework. But I think that as you're visiting places, you're learning as you go along. And for children, I think that this is particularly important because they're not going to have that sense awareness that you get when you're physically in another place that you would from watching a movie or reading a book. And I think this is particularly important when they're first encountering populations that are different than what they're used to. Like when we went to the Navajo Nation in the Four Corners, that was an experience where they were seeing things in a foreign language. They were seeing the daily lives of Indigenous people, eating Indigenous food, seeing a landscape that, physically, geologically, is utterly alien from what we're accustomed to in Missouri, and they loved every minute of it. But I think they got more out of that. Now when we hear about sites being threatened in that region, in Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and so forth, it hurts our hearts, I think, in a way that it would have, but not with the immediacy from having seen it firsthand, which is why I think travel is very beneficial. It's beneficial for conservationists, historians, but just for humanity, for people to understand each other, to have more empathy for each other, and to support each other when times get hard.
Sarah, let's move on to question number 2. Missouri plays a central role in the story that you are telling, and you've already brought it up in our first question. But I want to dive a little bit more deep into it. What is the importance of the state to you and to America?
Well, Missouri is like a microcosm of America. Even physically, it looks like one. You have two big cities, St. Louis, where I live, and Kansas City, on the east and west coasts. You have a lot of small towns in between. You have swampland in the south. You've got plains in the north. So, in a way, it even looks like a little America. And traditionally, it's been the bellwether of American politics and of American culture. All of these people who basically envisioned the idea of America. Mark Twain with the great American novel, Walt Disney, Chuck Berry, who invented rock and roll. They came from Missouri. There's something about this place that instilled this kind of creativity. And I think it is that central location where it's not east, it's not west, it's not north, it's not south. It's where everything kind of collides and mixes. And it's also where a lot of historic tragedies and historic crimes have taken place. It's where the Dred Scott decision was made. It's where slavery was allowed as a trade-off, for Missouri to be accepted as a slave state. Maine became accepted as a free state, which they called a compromise, but that was really just an exchange of human bondage. So Missouri is, this sort of moral reckoning point historically. And up until 2008, it was also the state that would most reliably predict the winner of any presidential election. Nowadays you get this reputation of, oh, it's a deep red state, it's so Republican. That's not true at all. It would alternate constantly. And until Citizens United appeared, until dark money began to flood elections, and until, of course, we had a Black president, which, brought out a lot of racism within the population nationwide, but, particularly in Missouri, we tended to go with the flow. And the thing is I still see us as a bellwether state. I just see us as a bellwether of decline. A lot of the really awful tendencies of the 21st century originated here, far right movements, the rise of people like Rush Limbaugh, again, from Missouri. On the flip side, though, you see the protest movements also originating here, particularly with Ferguson and with pushes for civil rights. So we're a complicated state, we're a big mix. And my children were born into this mix. So in a sense, when we explore the rest of America, we're doing so from the perspective of Missouri. But what does that mean? It means we're doing so from the perspective of just anything you could possibly imagine. Because while folks might write off my state as very boring, as flyover country, quote unquote, it's an actually really interesting place to be in terms of contemporary politics, and also in terms of history. And it's one that's informed the history of the rest of the United States in quite a profound way.
We got about 90 more seconds on this question, and you already brought up Mark Twain, who appears a lot in your book. Can you talk a little bit more about the importance of Mark Twain to Americans and to Missouri?
Well, he's the quintessential American writer. I think he's the person who did invent the American novel, and he was born in Missouri. His family were Southern slave owners who moved to Missouri, to this part called Little Dixie, because it was a section where slave owners tended to settle. And he joked that he had to be born in Missouri so that Missouri, a new state, could get a tourist attraction. But Twain was much more complicated than his kind of jocular reputation indicates. He was somebody who was struggling with questions of of corruption, imperialism, racism, some of which were addressed in a forthright way in his novels, in his essays. But most of all, I was drawn to his diaries, which he wouldn't allow to be published until 100 years after his death because he found them so humiliating. And the deep vulnerability and fear that he expressed about the direction of this country. I think if folks read those diaries now, which were written largely in the 19th century, they will relate to a lot of the content, particularly his fear about national dissolution and his frustration and anger with the hypocrisy of our officials.
Sarah, let's move on to our third question. Whether it was the physical landscape, the economy, or politics, America changed during your time in the car. Can you describe for us what you were seeing around you while on the road?
Yeah, I mean it's hard in a way to look back because when we set out in 2017, I felt like things were pretty bad, but I had more hope for the future than I did then. I think we've been through a lot, the world has been through a lot, and I think the kind of defining event, the one that kind of demarcates the book, is COVID appearing in 2020, which obviously, when you're talking, about a book about travel, that stopped our travel in its tracks. That forced me to be very creative at any rate, visiting places close to us, visiting places like Mark Twain's hometown of Florida, Missouri, population zero, because I knew nobody would be there. But I also think it changed social trust. It changed how people relate to each other. I think changes in technology also informed the direction we took even more than politics did. The fact that people feel like they can film each other, they can invade each other's privacy, they rarely give each other space, they rarely give each other the benefit of the doubt. Those tendencies were always there, but now they're incentivized. We had people like Elon Musk buy Twitter. We have algorithms that incentivize cruelty and want you to treat other people, human beings, as content and exploit them. And all of that changes, the way that you maybe act face to face, though I found that people tend to be much kinder face to face, but certainly the way information about the places you visit is presented online. And there's one more thing I'm grateful I took these trips when I did, which is that there were not AI images permeating the internet when we set off, in 2017 in the way they are now. And so my children, thankfully, are able to recognize fakes, with much greater skill than they would have had because they've seen so much of this country. They've seen 38 states, and they've also seen small towns. They've seen different cultures. They know when something looks suspicious. They know when something looks like it's put up by a bigot to try to present a population in a certain light. And so I'm glad that they had these firsthand experiences. But what a dystopia we've inherited in these 8 years. It came at us from a variety of angles, some of which I was very much prepared for, which is why I sought to have them see as much of the country as they possibly could, as quickly as they could, but some of which arose with such speed. And I really am thinking of the artificial intelligence and, the demise of media and replacement with sort of video-oriented social media and so forth, that even I couldn't anticipate it. I think it's even more challenging for parents now. I've heard from a lot of parents about this book and also about a previous book I wrote, Hiding in Plain Sight, in which the epilogue was on this theme as well, about road trips around America before it ended. A lot of folks feel that compulsion to show their kids, the good in the country, the beauty in the country, so they're not just bombarded with horror or with, stereotypes and generalizations that are demeaning and untrue.
We got about 2 more minutes for this question. Can we dive deeper into how the climate has changed during your road trips, especially with regards to fires and flooding?
Yes, I mean we drove west a lot, and when you drive west in the summer, we discovered we are outrunning fires. At every turn, there were so many points where I would look back at photos I took at these beautiful forest landscapes, and I'd realize that place burnt to the ground, within a week of our visit, and so it always felt like we were, on a narrow miss. It always felt like danger was lurking around every corner because, it was. There's a picture of me in front of the Colorado River, and you could see it, greenish and dried up in the background, and on the flip side, we dealt with floods. Our own neighborhood had the worst flood in its history in 2022. So living through a climate disaster, that was a new experience for me, although we just had in St. Louis the worst tornado, since 1959. And so we're recovering from the devastation of that. That unfortunately is what the 21st century is going to be like. And it breaks my heart because, you don't get these places back. And we have these plutocratic opportunists who see every disaster, particularly if it hits an impoverished population, as a chance for them to build some sort of, techno dystopia surveillance state in its place. At least that's what their ambition is, which is why I think conservation is so important. Preserving historical ruins is so important. I think we have people who they view other human beings as disposable. They don't think our existence is necessary. They don't think, preserving endangered species and wildlife and trees and so forth is necessary. I think it's what it means to be human is to have those things, our imagination, our appreciation for nature, our desire to protect it. And I feel the way towards my country that I do toward my children. That's the strange relationship you have, I think, as an American, because America is kind of an abusive country. So on one hand, you feel like a child here, you feel like a child with an abusive parent. On the other hand, I love this country with a protectiveness that is not rational, given that level of abuse. It comes straight from the heart because it's my homeland. And I would, not do anything to protect it. I wouldn't do something immoral, but I want very much for the best things about it, its finest attributes to be preserved and kept safe. And I actually don't think I'm rare at all in that desire. I think most Americans are on the same page with me. We just don't have that kind of structural power.
Sarah, let's move on to question number 4. The national parks are prominent stops for Americans traveling, and your book highlights how your family was no exception. What was your experience like visiting them in the many different states that you went to?
Well, I'm really glad I went when I did. And, everything about that situation has changed quite a lot, since 2017, in part because of, as we've mentioned, ecological disasters, but also because, Trump in his first term threatened to, destroy them and did remove protections for a few federal lands. They're now threatening to sell off 40% of our federal lands, including some lands of state monuments and national parks. And so that's a very frightening thing. It doesn't bring me comfort to know that I saw it when I could. I mean, I'm obviously glad I did rather than didn't, but the idea of these beautiful places being gone breaks my heart. A lot of them are also sacred sites for Native Americans. It's not just a matter of a pretty landscape. This is something that's very, deep within different American cultures. And so it's just been awful to see these news because of the book. People constantly bombard me with stories about what is being destroyed. And, I'm kind of like, I'm keenly aware I don't need to see pictures of a place I love and know that it's about to be torn apart every single day. But yeah, I hope, if anything, my book inspires people to fight hard for these parks. The fact that the government would choose it as a target is really revealing because everybody loves the national parks. It's probably the most agreed upon political project in American history. And so to target that is an extremely anti-American act, and one that shows they don't care about winning elections. They don't care about any modes of traditional political power. They're just out to strip the country for parts, steal the resources, and profit. And it's just, it's such a shameful thing.
As there's a scene that I remember in the book where I think I don't remember which state it was, but you were finally able to look up to the sky and see the stars, and tears started flowing. Like that's pretty natural. As a human, you want to be out in nature. It restores your soul, right?
Yes, absolutely. And appropriately enough, that was at Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And Theodore Roosevelt was the president, who began the national park system and was the first sort of, environmentalist president that we had. That park is located in western North Dakota in a pretty remote location. And that was the first time in my life that I saw the Milky Way. And I was 40 years old. And, it was a new moon and it was a clear night. And we knew our odds were pretty good, but I had never seen it before. And this is such a remarkable thing because 100 years ago, most people on Earth saw the Milky Way. It was not something that was difficult to find. But because of industrialization, light pollution, it's a real struggle. And I was so overwhelmed by its beauty, by its enormity, that I started to cry. And I was crying in awe, but I was also crying because of all I had missed in the 40 years prior, having not seen it. And from that point onward, wherever we would go, we would seek out a place where we could see the Milky Way. And we're lucky that we live in Missouri because, it's not that hard to do it. You can drive deep into a forest, and if you can find a clearing, then you're pretty good to go. But a lot of people, I don't think my parents have ever seen it. I don't think most people I know, especially if they live in cities, have ever seen it. And this used to be part of our universal human bond. This is something that connected us all together. And for it to be gone in such an abrupt way, often without our knowledge, because it happened before we were born, I think is a tragedy and kind of a revealing one, in that you don't know what you're missing until you finally see it, and then it hits you very hard.
Sarah, let's move on to our final question. You showcase very clearly the necessity of facing head-on the reality of the history of the United States. Walk us through the ways that the myths, distortions, and bending of the truth can be broken down by physically seeing and experiencing the country.
In recent years, there is a movement to try to teach accurate history to Americans and to not whitewash or sugarcoat something like slavery or Native American genocide or Japanese internment camps or Jim Crow or all these things that are just factual periods of our history. I'm not being political by naming them. This is simply what happened. And I think that children and everyone else should know them so that we have an accurate understanding of how other events and how these events came to unfold. And one of the things that chills me most is the idea of, the bystander, the person who just looked and watched people suffer and watched them be treated as human bondage and said nothing. And why does that happen? Because that is continuing to happen today. There's been now a backlash, a very strong one, against teaching accurate history. You see it in censorship in libraries and in schools. I think when you visit a place, whether it's a museum, a monument, a ruin, a Native American reservation, an old prison site, a site of state crimes, whatever it is, it brings home the fact that, these were other human beings, whoever they were, the victims or the villains. These were people living their lives and trying to justify their decisions or trying to break free of their oppression in the conditions that they were handed. It's not some exotic, thing. It's not some abstraction. I think a lot of times history is taught that way. I think especially for children, it's important that they feel what happened, that they can imagine what it would be like to be that person, than it is for them to memorize, dates and names and places and have it be kind of like a homework assignment. Like, I want them to sense the continuity between the past and now, how it's one long story, that goes, it diverts and breaks and goes in a variety of directions, but a lot of themes, they remain the same throughout time. And that's one of the reasons that so many political operatives don't want us discussing history in an accurate way. Is they don't want us to see the parallels between now and then. But I think it's very important to do so.
Final 2 minutes here. Obviously, visiting the places is important, but what about talking to the locals? We need to do that as well, right?
I do, but I try to respect people's space. I mean, often when I'm in somewhere, especially if it's a small town or a small community, people are very excited, to have a visitor, to have a tourist. They want to show me, what's there. They want to show me what local sites they think are important or, interesting foods or recommendations on things to do. When you travel with children, especially, people tend to be very friendly. They really want, kids to get as excited about the things that they got excited about when they were kids. And so when that happened, I would take full advantage of that kind of opportunity. But I also knew that a lot of people were looking at me wondering, what do I believe? What do I stand for? Am I a threat? Is like my white husband a threat? This is particularly true when we were in the Deep South, like in majority Black regions, or when we were in Native American regions, because these are communities that historically, have faced either exploitation or subjugation and don't necessarily want, strangers walking around. I mean, that's what we were. We were tourists. We were strangers. I also tried to be careful in the book to not speak for anybody. A lot of the direct quotes come from people who have died, from their diaries, from their quotes, from their public speeches. I did not want to overstep into people's privacy. I feel like I can speak about Missouri and about St. Louis with quite a bit of authority because I've lived here for 2 decades, but I don't think I could do that for a place that I visited for, just a few days, or for a man who I had a conversation with for just a few hours. So I was careful to kind of limit those interactions and respect the privacy and the space of the people who had no idea that they were talking to a professional writer at the time.
But that enhances the connection and the how do I want to put this, like the Americanness of road trips, right?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't know I was writing a book either. That's the thing. I thought I was just having a friendly conversation, which I was. So there's, nothing insincere about it. But yeah, the people you meet along the way, they're full of stories. They're full of anecdotes. They're full of facts that are not in books. They're not on the internet. You're not going to hear about them unless you're actually there and somebody opens up to you and trusts you, when you ask them, what did that building used to be? Things like that. There are a lot of buried histories that people think are unimportant. And especially because we've lost a lot of local news in the last few decades, we've lost a lot of history and record keeping. And I think people now, we have an oral history that preserves that, but to be able to access that history, you often need to go to the place in question.
Sarah, that has been 5 questions. You've answered them in 5 minutes. Thank you so much for joining us on Books in 5. Again, the title of the book is The Last American Road Trip. I'm going to put a link to the book in the show notes. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really nice.
The host of Books in 5 is Bhavan Sodan. Books in 5 is produced in collaboration with Podfather Creative in Vancouver, Canada.